Ronald Reagan's trip west was just the beginning of a longer journey, from bachelor to family man, from a New Deal liberal to what we now call a Reagan conservative, and of course from radio announcer to Hollywood actor. Just about everyone dreams of being a movie star. Sportscaster Dutch Reagan actually rolled the dice and won. Hollywood in the late 1930s, a land and a time when make-believe was real. Celebrities were treated like royalty, and the dream of big-screen stardom was, for many, as contagious as it was crazy. A seemingly unlikely playground for a young Dutch Reagan? Maybe not.
In the back of his head, it was that he thought he would really very, very much like to try out for film, see if he could get a screen test. He came out to California to cover the training season for the Chicago Cubs.
That was in 1937, but soon Reagan would parlay his job as a play-by-play commentator for WHO in Des Moines into a shot at movie fame. A musician friend suggested Reagan see her agent about his secret yearning to be an actor, advice the young Reagan did not ignore. And in less than a week, he managed to land a screen test with Warner Brothers Studios.
And shockingly to him, they hired him for a 7-year contract. That was the end of Dutch Reagan, and suddenly here was the birth of Ronald Reagan.
Reagan's years behind the microphone turned out to be the perfect training for Hollywood.
He said in radio, you have to imagine things.
Stop talking, children, and finish your curly crispy.
The audience has to construct this world of its own. Reagan, he'd been a sportscaster, and he'd been recreating baseball games from telegraph reports.
In his big screen debut, Reagan played, of all things, a young radio announcer.
I'll be back with more hot news. And just between you and the microphone, it'll be red hot.
Recalling years later his first day on the set, Reagan said, quote, "Nothing I'd ever experienced, nothing I'd been through had ever produced in me the kind of jitters I felt when I stepped onto stage 8 at Warner Brothers that morning." But those jitters quickly disappeared. By the end of 1938, Reagan already had 9 films to his credit. One of them, Brother Rat, a lighthearted comedy about 3 friends at a Virginia military institute, introduced the 27-year-old Reagan to Jane Wyman.
Polite indifference from the opposite sex is the fate of a woman wearing glasses.
Well, you're not wearing them now.
With youth and good looks on their side, Reagan and Wyman were quickly anointed by the fan magazines the ideal American couple. And despite his freshman status in Hollywood, Reagan made an impression on the Screen Actors Guild, thanks in no small part to Wyman. 93-year-old Jack Dales, who knew Reagan at the time, remembers.
She told us, the board, that she really had a guy there, and that he really belonged on that board. And with Jane's recommendation, we took him.
Reagan remembers it slightly differently. He said he wasn't asked, he was drafted to represent the industry's younger contract players. Either way, his impact on the SAG board would be immediate.
I found him a very affable guy who could talk to people even when they were opposite sides and not ever get them upset.
In January of 1940, Reagan and Wyman lifted their ideal couple status to a perfect union and were married. His movie career continued to flourish, but despite an impressive record of nearly 20 films in just 3 years, he hadn't gotten past what he called being the Errol Flynn of B pictures.
I guess we can't all have charm and good looks, too.
His next role, he believed, would change that. Reagan's 1940 portrayal of George Gipp in Newt Rockne All-American was a dramatic departure from his previous roles. It was a part he almost didn't get. Studio execs thought he was too slight to play the legendary Notre Dame football star, but Reagan convinced them otherwise.
He really made a great pitch, and he was really very good, and they hired him as that.
Win just one for the Gipper.
In the movie, the Gipper dies prematurely from pneumonia, an ailment that almost took Reagan's life as a child. Despite his performance in the film, Reagan's career wouldn't rise to the caliber of Hollywood A-list performers, but he did solidify his all-American good guy image that made him a fan favorite. In 1941, that image was further enhanced with the arrival of Reagan and Wyman's first child, Maureen.
Let's get out and walk. It looks so pretty.
You bet.
That same year, Reagan would get another chance at an A-list film, playing the part of a small-town playboy in Kings Row.
I was an awful little tuppy then, wasn't I? Oh, yes, I was. But you teased me. You tried to get fresh.
I was an awful kid, I guess.
That sweeping portrayal of pre-World War I life in the Midwest would be Reagan's last picture before a period in his life that would change America and him forever. 4 months after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, 31-year-old Reagan was called to active duty, where he eventually rose to captain in the Army Air Corps. Reagan never saw combat during World War II. Instead, he used his talents to produce and appear in more than 400 military training films. Those images of war, though created in Hollywood, left an indelible mark on Reagan later in life.
It's a 0. Check.
He was based in Culver City making training films, but he convinced himself that he was somehow there when the concentration camps were liberated, for example. Even though he only saw some of the footage, he imagined himself in the scene. And I guess that's part of his appeal. He can convince people. He's a great salesman.
During his service, Reagan and Wyman welcomed their second child, Michael, whom they adopted in 1945. A world at war didn't interrupt Reagan's filmmaking.
Open your heart, Johnny. I want to be a part of you, a part that goes with you on the battlefield.
But in the end, it would impact what followed in his life. Dealing with the bureaucracy common to a country at war was, Reagan wrote in his 1990 autobiography, the beginning of a political transformation that was born in an off-screen cauldron of deceit and subversion, and a personal journey of discovery that would leave me with a growing distaste for big government.
We're meeting it again now under the name of communism.
In March of 1947, Reagan was elected president of the Screen Actors Guild at a time when Hollywood was in turmoil, with unions battling studios and the threat of communist infiltration bringing Washington investigations out west.
When we tag them for what they are, traitors guilty of treason.
This was the first time in his life that he was in a position to influence people or to try to influence them, to persuade them.
As president of the Screen Actors Guild, it is my great privilege to...
Reagan's ability to move between the acting community and the studios they worked for benefited both. It also exposed him to a world that would overshadow and, by some accounts, compromise both his acting career and his personal life with Wyman. The world of politics. In October 1947, Reagan testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee during the so-called Red Scare in Hollywood.
Ronald Reagan was one of the so-called friendly witnesses who was cooperating with the committee talking about communism in Hollywood. However, Reagan did not name anybody, and so he was kind of taking an ambiguous stand. Reagan was trying to present the Screen Actors Guild as an anti-communist, very 100% American organization, so he wound up attacking some of his own members. A lot of people in Hollywood were playing this game that if we stigmatize a few people, we can protect the bigger group.
What that cost Reagan in terms of liberal support, he more than made up for in conservative allies and further fueled his political ambitions.
We can prove to the world that here in Hollywood, about 30,000 of us have been fighting against this particular infiltration for a long time.
But by 1948, Reagan's newfound obsession with politics would lead to the ideal American couple's undoing.
Jane Wyman said that one reason she divorced Ronald Reagan was that he became a bore with talking about politics. He became obsessed with politics.
Patricia Neal, who co-starred with Reagan in the 1949 British film The Hasty Heart, remembers Reagan soon after his divorce.
He was heartbroken. He really was, because he didn't want to divorce from her, but Jane wanted it.
Despite this personal setback, Reagan continued his hectic movie-making schedule.
Come on, Bonzo, I'll get you home. Now, hang on, Bonzo.
And in 1951, he starred in a comedy that, in later years, political opponents and pundits would satirize, Bedtime for Bonzo. But 1951 would forever change the 40-year-old actor-turned-activist. Mervyn LeRoy told Reagan about a young actress who he had directed in a recent film, who was extremely upset that her name was being mistakenly associated with a communist front group and needed Reagan's help.
Helen, you're angry.
Yes. At the lies that are told about women.
The actress's name was Nancy Davis.
So she went to Ronnie and told him who she was and what the problem was, and that started an affair, which ended in marriage.
March 4th, 1952. 7 months later, the couple welcomed their first child together, Patricia Ann.
Hello, honey. Hello.
Several years later, Ron and Nancy would be reunited again, this time on screen. It would also be the last film Nancy ever made.
I wanted to be sure this time, so we played it safe. Until I knew that you were Mr. Right.
He's warm, he's friendly, he's all those things. He's not the greatest actor in the world, but he was fantastic in films. He really was.
By the mid-1950s, Reagan's acting career had taken a backseat to his political aspirations, which colleagues in the industry who knew him then say is what he was better at anyway.
And they felt that, and they began to view him, I think, as more of a businessman than an actor. And you know, I don't really think Reagan was the greatest actor in the world.
A man's talents may be used for good or evil. Exceptional talents only widen the possibilities for both.
In September of 1954, Reagan agreed to host television's GE Theater, a move that would mark the beginning of another chapter in the transformation of Ronald Reagan.
Now, until next week then, good night for General Electric.
In some ways, the decade from 1954's GE Theater to 1964's Republican National Convention were Ronald Reagan's years in the wilderness. But it wasn't aimless wandering. The journey that began in Hollywood ended in what for many people was the most shocking and unlikely place they could imagine, the California governor's mansion. That's the next part of our story. Stay with us.